What's up guys, my name is Ace, and now that we've had the 2v2 Gunfight Alpha on PS4 for Modern Warfare, I was actually able to calculate basically all of the important stats for the weapons that we had access to throughout this alpha. In today's video, I wanted to focus on a certain set of stats. This is the sprint out and aim down sight times, because I have been seeing quite a few complaints online about how slow these times are. So like I said, I collected stats on all of the weapons we had access to, and I want to compare these to other Call of Duty games to see if this is really out of the ordinary and if these are in fact too slow. Now just to clear this up for the people that might not be aware, sprint out time is the delay between you sprinting and being able to fire your gun. So if you're sprinting and you press the fire button, sprint out time is the delay after you press the fire button until your weapon actually goes off. Now at first glance, this stat might seem very insignificant, but it's actually one of the key stats in determining the pace of a game. If the sprint out times are too slow, then that discourages people from ever using the sprint button because it's far too risky to be caught sprinting, and therefore that will slow the pace of the game down. People would rather be just slowly moving around the map and pre-aiming things because they don't want to be punished for getting caught sprinting. On the other side of that, if you have the sprint out time way too fast, that can really strongly reward and encourage people that are rushing extremely aggressively, and especially in an online environment, they can really take advantage of something called peeker's advantage, which means when you come around a corner, especially if you're coming around sprinting really quickly, you will always see the enemy player before they're able to see you because that data hasn't reached them yet. And with a really fast sprint out time, you can be putting shots into them before you're even visible on their screen. Additionally, when it comes to gameplay balance, it does take some of the tactics and the strategy out of it if the sprint out time is too fast, because at least in a lot of people's opinions, you should be punished if you're not prepared for that fight and you just sprint into a situation when the other guy's prepared for you and not sprinting into that situation. So at the end of the day, it's all about finding that sweet spot and finding that balance with sprint out time so it's not too slow to the point where the game becomes way too slow and boring and nobody even wants to move around, but also not too fast so that you reward that mindless sort of rushing playstyle. So let's start breaking this down, and a big thing to keep in mind with this is we don't have access to all of the attachments and perks and things that we will have access to once we get into the beta and into the full build of the game. And also with some of the numbers I calculated, I wasn't 100% sure which attachments are on that gun. Yes, sometimes it would display some of the attachments, but it wouldn't necessarily display all of the attachments that were on that weapon for that particular round where I was doing my testing. And in Modern Warfare, attachments can have both positive and negative effects on various stats like your sprint out or your aim down sight time. So keeping those disclaimers in mind, let's hop into the numbers I calculated during the alpha. For SMGs, our standard sprint out time was right around 250 milliseconds on average. This is noticeably faster than back in COD 4, and as a base sprint out time, it's even a little bit faster than Modern Warfare 2 and Modern Warfare 3, but keep in mind with both of those Call of Duties, we had perks that allowed us to really significantly cut our sprint out and aim down sight times down. Whereas in Modern Warfare, based on what we've seen so far within the Gunsmith, there are a couple options to reduce sprint out time, but we don't know just how much you can reduce them. But if we're just looking at the base sprint out times, which is all we can really do at this point, it's definitely a little bit faster than the Modern Warfare trilogy, but when we compare it to a lot of the more recent Call of Duty games, if anything, it's a little bit on the slow side. As for our Super sprint out time, so Super Sprint is what you can do by double tapping the sprint button. Your gun will come up, and you can sprint much faster for a short period of time. With this, of course, you also have a noticeably longer sprint out time, which absolutely makes sense. That's one of the risks of using the Super Sprint. When doing this, our sprint out time bumped all the way up to about 300 to 330 milliseconds, which is quite slow for an SMG. Also, just wanted to point out for our aim down sight times on SMGs, this had a range between 160 and 250 milliseconds, which is quite a wide range, and I think these definitely were affected by some of the attachments on the weapon. But that range is pretty much in line with the more recent Call of Duty games, which is to say, it is quite fast and pretty solid for an aim down sight time. Moving on to the assault rifle category, we had an average sprint out time of right around 300 milliseconds, which is pretty standard for basically the entire Call of Duty franchise. Assault rifles have always sort of been in that range. Even back to COD 4, our assault rifle sprint out time was 300 milliseconds. As for Super Sprint with assault rifles, this will cut it down very significantly, all the way down to about 450 milliseconds, which is painfully slow, so you're really punished if you get caught in a Super Sprint with an assault rifle. As for our aim down sight time, this is also pretty standard for assault rifles. It had a range between 280 and 300 milliseconds, which is right around where we would normally expect to see that. Getting into the LMG category, we only had access to 2 of the LMGs for the alpha, so not a huge sample size here. But our sprint out times were quite slow, and they would range between 330 and 400 milliseconds. And a 400 millisecond sprint out time is painfully slow in Call of Duty. Most guns can kill you before you can even fire a bullet if you get caught sprinting with an LMG. So you just stand no chance whatsoever, and therefore you are definitely discouraged from sprinting with that. Which is one of the downsides of LMGs. They're quite powerful in this game when it comes to just raw killing potential. So that's definitely one of the things that keeps it in check, is those sprint out times. And I think this is where a lot of the complaints came from when it comes to slow sprint out times in this game. That had to do with the extremely slow sprint out times of the LMGs. As for Super Sprint with an LMG, this would slow it all the way down to 500 milliseconds, which again, that is extremely slow in Call of Duty terms. And more surprisingly, our aim down sight times, again, keeping in mind, I don't know exactly what attachments are on there, but our aim down sight times were ranging between 400 and 567 milliseconds. I don't think I have ever seen a full auto gun in Call of Duty aim down sight as slow as these LMGs were. Which again, does kind of make sense for that class style. LMGs are mainly designed to like hang back and lock down a lane. They're not designed so you can rush around with them like you can in Black Ops 4, for instance. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, this is so much slower than we've ever seen in a Call of Duty game, and therefore I think this was really jarring to a lot of people, and this is where a lot of those complaints originated from. Now, these are the 3 main class types I wanted to focus on for this video. I'm not going to get into every single weapon class, but assault rifles, SMGs, and LMGs, those are sort of the main bread and butter sort of guns that you see within Call of Duty. And when we go back to that question, are the sprint out and aim down sight times really slow in Modern Warfare? I would say yes and no. Like I said, when it comes to assault rifles, they behave pretty much exactly like assault rifles have always behaved when it comes to these 2 stats. When it comes to SMGs, they're not quite as slow as they were way back in the day with like COD 4, but they're not quite as fast as we've been seeing in the more recent years with Call of Duty. Then finally, looking at the LMGs, like I said, these are by far the slowest. This is the most extreme sprint out and aim down sight times I think I have ever seen in Call of Duty. They are so slow. And honestly, while I do think LMGs definitely should have that slower handling, I think maybe in this area they took it a little bit far, but again, we can't really say anything for certain until we have access to all of the features in the full build of the game. Perhaps the builds that we were getting with the LMGs within Gunfight were just stacked with attachments that significantly reduced our aim down sight and sprint out times, and therefore it's really skewing these stats. But that's definitely something we'll have to keep an eye on as we get more access to the game. Now, I will say, based on my experience with Gunfight and the various weapons, I do really like that there is more of a clear distinction when it comes to these handling stats for SMGs versus assault rifles versus LMGs. I feel like that line has been blurred in many of the recent Call of Duty games where they've all been kind of forced together to have a very similar sprint out and aim down sight time as each other. And that just doesn't really make much sense when you're looking at the overall meta of balancing the weapons and the different weapon types. So overall, just looking at these stats that I was able to calculate within the alpha, I wouldn't say that in general the sprint out and aim down sight times are way too slow or painfully slow for this game. So for a lot of people that are saying that, I'm just not really seeing that yet, with the exception of the LMGs. Like I said, those are extremely slow, but that might be due to attachments. And that's really the key here. We don't know exactly how much of an impact certain attachments will have on our aim down sight and sprint out times. And this is why it's great to have this sort of early look so we can see some of these stats and get a general indication of how things are. But we really need to get our hands on the beta, which will give us far more options. We'll have access to the gunsmith option, and we'll be able to customize things. We'll also start to see different class types of weapons against each other, because that's something you didn't really get to see within Gunfight. You didn't really see SMGs versus LMGs, or SMGs versus assault rifles, for instance, with the exception of maybe the OSP mode, but even then, it doesn't really give you the greatest indication. And we also had those really small 2v2 maps, so that will also affect how things behave and how certain guns will play against each other. But this is where I want to hear from you guys. Based on the initial stats that have come out here about the sprint out and aim down sight times, and just based on your experience with the Gunfight Alpha, how are you guys feeling about the current sprint out and aim down sight times? Did you really see that as a problem? Do you feel like it's too slow? Or are you quite happy with where the sprint out and aim down sight times are at? Just let me know those thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.